By 1965, many felt that the Beatles had reached their high water mark, that they had worn thin their goodwill and soon would fade into obscurity. This would have most likely been true, as it was for many acts of the time, except that the band decided on a new direction for their next record. What if they produced music that could not be performed live, mimicked the euphoria of free love, and thought of the studio as an instrument itself? Revolver would be the landmark album that changed everything in music. Most records at the time, including the Beatles, sounded like a live show, and in many ways was. Bands would set up in the studio and hammer out their songs with minimal overdubs or effects. That's not to say that these weren't used at all, but you would be hard-pressed to find these elements in many of the big hits of the time. The Beatles were also getting fed up with touring. It was simply too chaotic, with screaming fans, rebellious crowds, and growing backlash against the group, especially after John Lennon's comments about the band being bigger than Jesus. They were also growing up. Rubber Soul featured some deeply personal tracks and tiptoed into the studio experimentation. They would go further with this on Revolver. They went to producer George Martin and gave him all their ideas, no matter how abstract, and he would find a way to make it happen in the studio. Assisting George was a 19-year-old Jeff Emerick, who was more than happy to help break the rules established in traditional studio recording. The original concept was to make an album with no gaps between songs, which John suggested. While this ended up not happening here, it would make appearances between tracks on later albums. Each track was worked on mostly in studio from the ground up, furthering the experimental mood. Jeff said, "Every instrument should sound unlike itself. A piano shouldn't sound like a piano, a guitar shouldn't sound like a guitar." That said, the band never intended to perform these songs live, which gave them the freedom to be as experimental as they wanted to be. George Harrison incorporated instruments from his growing interest in classical Indian music. The guitars were punchier and fed through limiters and compressors. These are devices that remove and enhance certain frequencies and volumes while recording. They also brought in strings and horns to create a sort of schizophrenia on the album where audiences didn't know what was coming next. Ken Townsend, an engineer, developed a technique called automatic double tracking. ADT allows you to record the voice once on multiple tracks at the same time to be used later for manipulation. John particularly liked this invention. They also recorded vocals through a Leslie cabinet that spun around, giving a sort of Doppler effect. They were the very first to do this. Tape became the paint of the album's canvas. For Tomorrow Never Knows in particular, the members recorded their loops at home and then spliced everything together in the studio, live. Tapes were run backwards, forwards, sped up, slowed down, and everything else in between to create sounds never heard before. For the solo on I'm Only Sleeping, George intentionally performed it to be in reverse, creating something that sounds like it's both backwards and forwards at the same time. Jeff also tweaked the mics to pick up more of Paul's bass, giving the album a much heavier sound. The drums were dampened, recorded up close, and fed into a limiter. This technique was so effective that it drove many other engineers and studios insane trying to replicate it for their own facilities. The point here being, they did so much and invented so many techniques that it changed how music was recorded from that point forward. Several books and documentaries have been produced about it and are worth deep dives of their own for curious fans. When released, the album impact was instant. Bands immediately started trying to copy what they had done, with varying degrees of success. Most notably on the Beach Boys song, Good Vibrations. Beyond that, it was the big bang for many genres, artists, and creators who now had the album woven into their very DNA. Still, even today, we see these techniques being used and being standard features in most recording software. You could argue that the album could be recorded today on a smartphone, but the tools on that smartphone wouldn't exist if the album wasn't made in the first place. Paul said it best when the album was released. There are sounds here that nobody else has done yet. I mean nobody. Ever. What do you think about this album? Let me know in the comments below. The content on this channel is made possible from viewers like you. Help the channel grow by supporting me on Ko-fi, which you can find a link to below. You can also help by liking, commenting, sharing, and subscribing. Thank you again for watching, and I will see you guys next time.